I want you to listen to this song. Listen to it real good. In all likelihoods, you probably heard this song. But when you hear the song, you likely don't think George Bizet's Les Toreadors from Carmen Suite #1. No. You probably think of fuzzy animatronics, and a nice child's pizza restaurant, and murder. Lots and lots of murder. Howdy everybody, my name is Brockster, and in today's video, we're going to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's. With the Five Nights at Freddy's movie only months away, I feel like there's no better time to talk about this game. Where it went right, where it went wrong, and where it's going to be in the future. Without further ado, let's get into it. We of course can't talk about Five Nights at Freddy's without talking about the beginning. And oh boy, was the beginning explosive. Scott Cawthon's Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't meant to be a giant success, and in fact, it was kind of like a Hail Mary. Scott Cawthon had previously worked on a multitude of other games, but was failing and wasn't getting the success that he originally wanted. So, he decided to step away from religious types of games, which is what he previously worked on, and decided to go into a very, very different route. Hence, Five Nights at Freddy's. And oh boy, once it popped on the scene, that was it. Now, Five Nights at Freddy's was a really popular game upon release, but in no way would it have the popularity that it currently has if it wasn't for YouTube, and the YouTubers that decided to play the game. Anybody that was anybody was playing this game, and any YouTuber that was any YouTuber had played this game at least once. And this not only helped with the success of Five Nights at Freddy's, but it also helped with the success of a lot of YouTube channels, like the one and only Markiplier, who at the time had around 2 to 4 million subscribers. And well, look where he is now. Not to mention it kicking off a lot of other people's careers. This game was fantastic, not only because of its popularity, but because of the gameplay itself. We never really seen anything like that in terms of horror games. Most horror games have you walking around creepy locations, or exploring or doing puzzles. But this wasn't any Amnesia, this wasn't any Evil Within, this wasn't even Resident Evil. This was something completely different. The mechanic of just sitting there and scrolling through cameras had never really been seen by that time. It wasn't the fact that it was in a pizzeria with animatronics, which both are creepy on their own. It's the gameplay behind it, and more than that, the very subtle lore that was behind it as well, which only improved as the games went on. But we'll get into that. This game was a smashing success, and if that was the only one, well, it still would have been remembered as a great game. And then, Five Nights at Freddy's 2. In 2014, the same year that Five Nights at Freddy's was released, we got a sequel. And oh boy, was it a sequel. Now this is personally one of my favorite games because it added to the game without taking anything away. It was still the same concept, creepy animatronics going around, you stuck in an office looking through security cameras, yada yada yada, the same story. But it was different. The layout seemed bigger, there were more animatronics, and more than that, there was more story. Up to this point, the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's was extremely subtle, and by extremely subtle I mean practically non-existent. Everything was given very vaguely. But with the release of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, more things were added to the puzzle, and this led to people wondering what the lore of the game actually was. What's the story that's being told? And this, of course, launched Five Nights at Freddy's into a whole new area of popularity. With channels like The Game Theorist trying to decode and solve the story, only added to the popularity of this game, and aided in the name of Five Nights at Freddy's becoming more and more common. It was already a common name, but by this point, it was at its peak. And with the game becoming more and more enjoyable with the sequel, it made people want more. More games, another sequel. Which in hindsight seems pretty selfish. But we got what we wanted. And then in comes Five Nights at Freddy's 3. I remember when this game came out because I remember the lead up to this game coming out. I was in middle school and I remember staying up to date on all the tabs, everything about this game, because Scott Cawthon really had his fun when teasing this game. From the images to the animatronic, to the cryptic messages that were sent through various websites, the hype for Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was insane. And upon release, it delivered. It took a very different turn with Five Nights at Freddy's 3 though. There were less animatronics, in fact there was only one. And sure, there were multiple jump scares by a variety of animatronics that aren't there, that were only hallucinations. It was at this point where the story of Five Nights at Freddy's really took off, because it had an ending. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 had this really weird and cool arcade mechanic to it, where there was a random chance that once you died to an animatronic, a weird arcade game would pop up on screen. And it was through these arcade games that we kind of got a little bit of a glimpse of the story. And Five Nights at Freddy's 3 really leading into this, where each time you finished a night, it would automatically pop up on screen with something else different happening the entire time. And through this, we were able to figure out that Springtrap, the yellow bunny was actually the killer that was killing the children in the pizzeria, and we were able to figure out what the story was to this game. Now, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was insane not only because of the game and the fact that we were getting more of a story, but because of how quick the ending of this game was found. I think it was found within a couple hours of the game's release, because there's two endings to this game, the good ending and the bad ending. The bad ending happens if you go through the entire game and don't find all of the Easter eggs. The good ending happens when you look through the Easter eggs and solve everything there. And finding all of these Easter eggs was ridiculous. You had to click on cupcakes on the cameras, you had to click on the tile of the wall like it's a pin code, you had to glitch through games. It was insane. But the ending, the true ending, well, it was very bittersweet, because it seemed like at this point, this was the end of the franchise. The souls of the kids was released, nothing's haunting the animatronics anymore, and it seemed like it was a perfect way to close the chapter on this book. And in fact, Markiplier, the king of Five Nights at Freddy's, said that this is a perfect way to end it.
That is the end of Five Nights at Freddy as far as I know. Like, I don't even think that I want there to be any more Five Nights at Freddy's after this.
And though I was slightly upset, me being little old me and still wanting more, I could understand that this wouldn't be a bad way to end it. But that's not where it ended, was it? Because then we got Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which took the game in a very different direction. It's still the same mechanics pretty much, but instead of being in a pizzeria or a horror attraction, you're in a house, opening and closing doors. And there was still story to it, but the story becomes very vague, and it opened up a whole new can of worms with that bite, since it wasn't the bite of 87, but the bite of 83, which only caused more and more questions. 2 years after that game was released, we got Sister Location, which wasn't a bad game, it was just different. But frankly, I forgot that Sister Location existed, because I was only thinking about the other past games, and the games that came after that. You see, it's at this point where I firmly believe that Five Nights at Freddy's kind of became its own monster. Because we got a Five Nights at Freddy's 1, 2, 3, 4, we got a Sister Location, and then it started to get a little bit silly. We got a Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, which I don't even remember what that was. Ultimate Custom Night, which is, the Ultimate Custom Night that you access at the end of all the games, except that's the entire game, with an absurd amount of animatronics. Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted, which again, I really don't remember what that was. Five Nights at Freddy's Special Delivery, which I, again, don't know what that is. And then Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, which is infamously known for being absurdly broken and overall just being a glitchy mess. It's also the game where you get to walk around the entire facility, which is very not Five Nights at Freddy's. Dare I mention FNAF World, which I don't even know is a game, and then you've got books on top of that, and merchandise, and posters, and board games. So what happened? How did this wildly successful game become such a mess? And the answer is actually quite simple. I just said it. The game became wildly successful. Almost too successful. Now, that's the unfortunate truth. When something becomes so successful, people want more. And then they want more. And more. And more. And people don't know when to stop. And I feel like Scott Cawthon kind of made a monster of his own making. The Five Nights at Freddy's community is massive, and it's a very cool community. Lots of things have come from it. Fan art, songs, theories. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But at some point, it started to feel like Five Nights at Freddy's was no longer Five Nights at Freddy's. It just became this household name that people saw as a way to profit off of. It's almost like the soul was no longer there. The mechanic of sitting down and watching cameras was completely eliminated by the end of these final games. And the very vague lore that kept people on their seats trying to decode and solve, well, those were solved too as the games progressed, as questions kept being answered over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the main problems. One of the attractions of Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't only the very simple yet terrifying gaming mechanics, it was the story. It was the fact that the story was vague and that the player had to answer it for themselves. And if they really wanted to know the story, they would have to work for it. Kind of like Dark Souls, and that's why I think Dark Souls and, frankly, any From Software game is so popular. It's because of that story aspect that comes with the game. But with books and games now explaining the entire story, that kind of attraction and fascination has gone away. And soon with the movie out, I'm sure we're gonna get more glimpses at what this story really is. For better and for worse. Five Nights at Freddy's is successful. It has been for nearly a decade. And they well deserve it. But I have to admit that I kind of miss 2014. Back when the game wasn't this giant phenomena and where the story wasn't completely told. Back in 2014, it was a mystery. It was fascinating, and it was simple. There were times I look back on the early days of Five Nights at Freddy's where you didn't have to worry about reading all the books or getting all the plushies and Five Nights at Freddy's merchandise. I miss the days where it was just you, in that office, where the story was so close to you and yet so far away, where you looked at the office and wondered, does this mean something? Is this an Easter egg? Does this help solve the story? And back where the scares didn't happen from walking around a giant pizzeria, it was just you in the office, watching some cameras, making sure your animatronics didn't show up at your door, all while the ambiance of the pizzeria hit your ears, not knowing where they are, not knowing when they're gonna strike. And then the lights go out, and that subtle song fills the dark office.